The vampire king froze mid-step when he saw the janitor draping her worn coat over a shivering old woman in the palace courtyard. What no one knew, that beggar was his banished mother, and the girl had just signed her own death warrant, or her coronation. Now he had 3 nights to decide which. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Lucian Thorne had ruled for 600 years without hesitation, and tonight was no different as he pressed his royal seal into warm wax on the third execution warrant, the parchment joining its brothers on the obsidian table where the council had just dispersed into shadows and whispered dissent about his iron grip on the Northern Territory. The ink was barely dry when he rose from the high-backed chair, his movements fluid and ancient, boots silent against stone floors that had drunk the blood of 1,000 petitioners who'd begged for the very mercy he refused to grant, because mercy was weakness, and weakness was death, in a kingdom his brutal father had carved from centuries of vampire wars. He crossed through the vaulted corridors where torchlight threw his elongated shadow against tapestries depicting conquest and submission, his mind already moving to the next session, the next judgment, the next display of power that kept the noble houses in line and the human servants appropriately terrified. Which was why he didn't expect his entire existence to crack open the moment he stepped into the midnight courtyard, where frost made the cobblestones treacherous and his breath, though he didn't technically need to breathe, misted in the freezing December air. The courtyard was empty as it should be at this hour, just iron lamps throwing pools of amber light across ice and stone, the palace looming around him in Gothic spires and narrow windows that watched like judgmental eyes. And he was 3 strides toward his private wing when movement near the servant entrance made him stop with the sudden grace of a predator sensing prey. A girl, small and wrapped in a coat so worn the fabric was nearly transparent at the elbows, was kneeling beside a huddled figure that Lucien's vampire vision identified as an old woman, a beggar by the look of her, though how she'd gotten past the guards was a question that would require someone's head on a spike by morning. The girl was speaking, her voice too low for human ears but clear enough to Lucien's enhanced hearing, saying something about the cold and how no one should be out here without warmth. And then, as Lucien watched with the detached curiosity of someone observing an insect, the girl stood and began removing her coat, her fingers clumsy with cold as she worked the buttons free and draped the threadbare thing over the old woman's shaking shoulders with a tenderness that made something uncomfortable twist in Lucien's chest. The beggar's face tilted up toward the lamplight as the girl adjusted the coat, tucking it around her with gentle hands, and Lucien's heart, which beat only when he remembered to make it beat, suddenly hammered against his ribs with a force that nearly drove him to his knees, because the face in the lamplight was Eleanor, his mother, whom he'd banished 60 years ago under his father's dying command for the crime of showing mercy to a human rebellion leader when mercy was treason and treason was exile or death. She looked ancient now, her vampire immortality unable to hide the weight of 6 decades spent in the frozen wastes beyond the kingdom's borders. Her hair white instead of the dark auburn he remembered, her cheeks hollow, her hands skeletal as they clutched the girl's coat with a desperation that sent grief surging through Lucien's chest like a blade he'd thought he'd pulled out centuries ago. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there in the shadows, while his mother's eyes, still that piercing green he'd inherited, met his across the courtyard for one suspended heartbeat before she looked away quickly, deliberately, as if she could protect him from the consequences of her presence by pretending she hadn't seen him. The girl, oblivious to the silent destruction happening 10 feet away, was helping Eleanor to her feet now, saying something about a warm bed in the servant dormitories and how it was just for tonight, just until the cold snap passed, her voice carrying that particular quality of someone who'd grown up with nothing and knew exactly what nothing felt like when it froze your bones and stole your hope. Lucien heard footsteps behind him, the distinctive military cadence that meant Victor, his chief guard, and the closest thing to a friend he'd allowed himself in 4 centuries. And then Victor's voice, low and urgent at his shoulder, cutting through the roaring in Lucian's ears with words that landed like stones in deep water. "The law is clear, sire," Victor whispered, his hand already moving to the blade at his belt with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd enforced vampire law for 300 years and knew that aiding an exile was punishable by sharing their fate, which meant both women, the beggar and the girl, must be taken before dawn and brought before the council for judgment that would end in blood or banishment, because there were no other options under the statutes Lucian himself had spent 6 centuries upholding without exception. "Not yet," Lucien heard himself say, the words scraping out of his throat like rust, his hand rising in a gesture that froze Victor mid-reach with the absolute authority of a king who could command death with a lifted finger. "I invoke my right to 3 nights' investigation under the mercy precedent," Lucian continued, his voice steadier now, cold and controlled the way he'd trained it to be when his father had beaten the emotion out of him with fists and fangs, and the constant reminder that a king who showed weakness would be torn apart by his own court before the century turned. Victor's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the wind that had picked up, carrying the scent of snow and iron. And when he spoke again, his voice held the careful neutrality of a man who'd just watched his king invoke a law so ancient and unused that most vampires thought it was decorative, a relic from a gentler time that had no place in their current brutal efficiency. "That law hasn't been used since your grandfather's reign," Victor said, and Lucian could hear the unspoken question underneath. The concern that maybe the king was finally cracking under the weight of 600 years of merciless judgment, that maybe this was the beginning of the weakness the noble houses were always watching for. "Then it's overdue," Lucien said simply, his eyes tracking the girl as she guided his mother toward the servant entrance, their figures growing smaller in the lamplight, and he committed every detail to memory, the girl's dark hair escaping a braid, the way she matched her pace to Eleanor's shuffling steps, the coat that was clearly her only defense against winter now wrapped around a stranger she had no reason to help. When they disappeared through the doorway, Lucien finally moved, not toward his chambers, but toward the archives, leaving Victor standing in the courtyard with orders to say nothing until Lucien decided what nothing meant. The archives smelled of leather and dust, and the particular mustiness of parchment that had survived centuries, and Lucien lit a single candle because even his vampire vision needed some light to read the faded ink of laws written before his birth, before his father's reign of terror, before mercy had become a word that tasted like poison on his tongue. He found the mercy precedent after an hour of searching, buried under property disputes and tax codes, the parchment brittle and yellowed, but the words still clear in his grandfather's elegant script, explaining that a king might, once per reign, pardon a single act of compassion if the petitioner could pass 3 trials, proving their heart was pure, untainted by politics or performance, genuinely moved by nothing more than the human, or in this case very human-like, impulse to ease suffering they witnessed. Lucien read it 3 times, his finger tracing the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous, less likely to crack open the iron shell he'd built around himself when he'd signed his mother's exile papers with his father's corpse still warm on the throne, and the noble houses watching to see if the new king was strong enough to rule or weak enough to be replaced. He had 72 hours until the Winter Solstice Council, when all laws invoked under the precedent must be judged and all trials completed, which meant he had 3 nights to decide if a janitor's threadbare coat and his mother's hollow cheeks were worth destroying everything he'd built on the foundation of merciless consistency. The candle burned lower, wax pooling on the ancient desk, and Lucien sat in the silence, broken only by his own unnecessary breathing and the turning of pages as he searched for loopholes he knew he wouldn't find, because his grandfather had been thorough and idealistic in ways that had gotten him killed by Lucien's father, who'd understood that idealism was just another word for vulnerability. Outside the narrow window, snow began to fall, and somewhere in the servant dormitories, A girl who'd given away her only coat to a freezing stranger was probably sleeping with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd done a small kindness and expected nothing in return, unaware that she'd just signed her own death warrant or her coronation, and that the vampire king was sitting alone in the dark, trying to remember what it felt like to love his mother more than he feared looking weak. Mara woke to pounding on her door before dawn had fully broken, the sky outside her narrow window still that bruised purple that meant the sun was thinking about rising but hadn't committed yet, and when she opened the door expecting another servant with news of a broken pipe or an overflowing latrine, she found instead two palace guards in formal armor who told her in voices that permitted no argument that she was summoned to the throne room immediately. She dressed in a panic, her fingers fumbling the buttons on her only other shirt, a thin cotton thing that did nothing against the December cold, now that her coat was gone, and as she followed the guards through corridors she normally cleaned but never walked, as anything other than invisible labor, her mind raced through possibilities that ranged from being fired for giving palace property, to a beggar, to being arrested for something she couldn't name, but felt certain she'd done, because people like her, poor and human and insignificant, were always guilty of something in the eyes of people with power. The throne room was exactly as cavernous and cold as she'd imagined during the hundreds of times she'd scrubbed its marble floors on her knees, but she'd never seen it from this angle, standing in the center with her neck craned back to see the throne elevated on its dais, where the vampire king sat backlit by windows that turned him into a silhouette of absolute authority, Victor at his right hand, like a sword waiting to be drawn. Lucian Thorne looked different from the glimpses she'd caught while cleaning, more solid and terrifying now that his attention was fixed on her like a wolf deciding whether something was prey or just scenery. And when he spoke, his voice carried through the vaulted space, with the particular resonance of someone who'd never had to raise his voice to be obeyed in 600 years. "You have been seen aiding a known exile," he said, and the words landed like stones in deep water, heavy and sinking, dragging her stomach down with them as she tried to process what exile meant and how the old woman shivering in the courtyard could possibly be known to anyone, let alone someone who warranted capital punishment for the crime of receiving a coat. Mara heard herself say she was just cold, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, confusion making her stupid and honest when she should have been calculating her survival, and she saw Lucian's jaw tighten in a way that suggested he'd heard defiance instead of bewilderment. He explained the mercy precedent then, his words precise and cold as he outlined how she had 3 nights to prove her compassion was pure and not performative, how she would face 3 trials of his design, how failure meant death for both her and the woman she'd helped, execution at solstice dawn in front of the assembled court as an example of what happened when humans interfered with vampire law. Mara's knees went liquid and she locked them by sheer force of will, refusing to collapse in front of this creature who'd just told her that kindness was a capital crime, and when she asked, "What are the trials?" her voice only shook a little, which felt like a victory, even though victory was probably a concept that had stopped applying to her life the moment she'd draped her coat over a stranger's shoulders. Lucienne rose from the throne with fluid grace and led her through the palace to the hospital wing, a part of the complex she'd heard about but never entered because it was for human servants who got sick or injured and she'd been healthy enough to avoid it, though healthy was relative when you were cold and tired all the time from wages that barely covered food and a shared room in the dormitories. The wing smelled of antiseptic and despair, thin blankets on narrow cots, drafts coming through poorly sealed windows, and the few patients there looked up at the vampire king with expressions that mixed hope and terror in equal measure before quickly looking away as if eye contact might be fatal. Lucienne handed her a ledger, the pages filled with numbers that made her head hurt, and explained that this was the monthly budget for the human hospital wing, that she had 1 hour to allocate resources, that every choice she made would be binding and would determine who lived and who suffered and who died slowly from treatable conditions because there would never be enough money to save everyone. The amount was cruelly insufficient, and Mara realized within 5 minutes that this was the test, not whether she could balance numbers, but whether she could make choices that meant someone would hurt because of her decisions, whether her compassion could survive the reality that mercy at scale required triage, and triage required becoming the kind of person who decided that this life mattered more than that one. She worked in agonized silence, tears streaking her face as she cut medications for people who were recovering to buy blankets for people who were hypothermic, as she reduced food rations for the mobile patients to afford better nutrition for the bedridden, as she became exactly the kind of monster she'd always feared in positions of power, someone who had to choose between bad options and worse ones with no right answer visible anywhere in the calculations. Lucian watched her the entire hour, his presence a weight on her shoulders as she scratched out numbers and rewrote them and crossed them out again. And when time expired, he reviewed her work in silence that stretched so long she thought maybe she'd failed by hesitating, by caring too much to be efficient. "You chose the dying over the healing," he said finally, his voice carrying no inflection that would tell her if this was condemnation or curiosity. And when he asked why she met his eyes for the first time since entering the hospital wing and said because the healing have time, the dying don't. Something flashed in Lucian's expression, something that looked almost like approval, before it disappeared behind the mask of cold authority. He wore like armor, and he left her standing there among the patients who would live a little better and the ones who would suffer a little more because of her choices. Midday found Mara in the servant quarters seeking Eleanor, who'd been quietly moved there under guard after Mara had taken her in, and the old woman's face crumpled when she saw Mara alive, then crumpled further when Mara explained about the trials and the 3 nights and the execution waiting at the end if she failed. Eleanor begged her to run, to denounce her and save herself, saying it over and over like a prayer that might change reality if repeated enough times. But Mara sat on the narrow bed and took the old woman's skeletal hands and said, "I'm not sorry I helped you," the words coming from some deep place that refused to regret compassion, even when compassion had apparently signed her death warrant. Eleanor broke then, the tears coming in silent streams down her hollow cheeks as she revealed that she was Lucien's mother, banished 60 years ago for showing mercy to a human rebellion leader, that her son had loved her once before. His father had beaten the softness out of him and turned him into the frozen king who now sat in judgment of a girl whose only crime was giving away a coat. Mara absorbed this information like a blow to the chest, understanding suddenly that the trials weren't random cruelty, but a test designed by someone who was himself being tested, who was using her to answer questions about mercy and compassion, and whether love could survive 6 decades of exile and centuries of brutal rule. Evening arrived too quickly, and with it another summons, this time to the council antechamber where firelight threw shadows across wood paneling and noble vampires gathered like predators scenting blood in the water. Lord Thane stood at the center, smug and powerful in expensive velvets, while a teenage boy, human and terrified, huddled near the wall with his hands twisted together as if prayer might save him from whatever was coming. Lucian explained Trial 2 with the same clinical precision he'd used for Trial 1, how Thane had accused the stable hand of stealing a ruby pin, how vampire law demanded hand amputation for theft from nobility, how Mara would judge this case and her ruling would be binding. It was a perfect trap, and Mara saw the teeth of it immediately, the way siding with the human would anger the nobles watching from the shadows, while siding with Thane would prove her mercy was selective, that she saved her compassion for people she deemed worthy instead of extending it universally the way true mercy required. She interviewed them both, listening to the boys' stammered protests of innocence and Thane's smooth accusations, watching their faces and their hands and the micro-expressions that gave away truth and lies if you knew how to look. The boy was terrified but truthful, his story consistent down to details he wouldn't have known to fabricate, while Thane's account had small inconsistencies, pauses where he seemed to be constructing rather than remembering. Mara noticed his cufflink then, a ruby pin worn as decoration, the same ruby pin he claimed had been stolen, and the pieces fell together in her mind with crystalline clarity that made her almost laugh at the audacity of it. She accused him of framing the boy to test the new king's lenience toward humans, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs, and Thane exploded with rage that confirmed her guess more surely than any confession. Lucian silenced him with a glance that promised consequences for nobles who forgot their place, then turned to Mara and asked what punishment for a false accusation, and she understood this was the real test, not whether she could identify injustice, but whether she could respond to it with something other than the violence that had been done to her. An apology, she said, the words clear and firm, public, in front of every servant he maligned, and she watched Lucien's lips almost curve into something that wasn't quite a smile, but suggested he'd hoped she'd say exactly that. He commanded it, and Thane stormed out while Victor muttered about dangerous precedent in a voice meant to be overheard. But Mara was watching the Vampire King and seeing for the first time that the trials were designed to have right answers, that he wasn't trying to destroy her, but to build a case for her survival out of choices that demonstrated her mercy could survive pressure and corruption and the very real cost of staying compassionate in a world that rewarded cruelty. Night brought Lucien to her door in the servant wing, an occurrence so unprecedented that Mara thought at first she was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. But he was solid and real in shirt sleeves with no crown, his presence enormous in the narrow hallway where a single sconce flickered and threw unstable light across his face. He asked why she gave her only coat, and she told him what her grandmother had taught her, that we're only as warm as the coldest person we pass. The words simple, but carrying the weight of a philosophy that had shaped her entire life, even when it meant going cold herself. He asked if she knew what her mercy would cost if she failed tomorrow's trial, and she met his eyes, those green eyes that she now knew came from his mother, and said, "I know, but I'd do it again," the admission both truth and defiance, because she refused to regret kindness, even when kindness was apparently a luxury she couldn't afford. Something shifted in Lucien's face, some crack in the frozen mask he wore, and he left without another word, but his hand hesitated on her doorframe for half a second. Fingers splayed against the wood, as if he wanted to say something or do something, but couldn't quite make himself cross whatever invisible line he'd drawn between king and subject, between vampire and human, between someone who'd spent 600 years killing his own heart, and someone who'd just reminded him what it felt like to have one. Lucien had not slept in 2 days, which was unusual even for a vampire who could go weeks without rest if necessary, but his mind refused to quiet, replaying the moment in the hospital wing when Mara had chosen the dying over the healing with tears streaming down her face, and the courtroom scene where she'd outmaneuvered Lord Thane with a cleverness that had made Lucien's cold heart stutter with something dangerously close to admiration, and underneath it all, the image of his mother's hollow face in the lamplight, a ghost made flesh by 60 years of exile he had signed into law with his own hand. At 2 a.m, he abandoned the pretense of rest and found himself walking the silent corridors back to the archives, that tomb of parchment and precedent where he'd spent the first night reading the mercy precedent. Though tonight he wasn't looking for laws, but for something he'd avoided touching for 6 decades, something that sat in a locked drawer in the back corner where the oldest files moldered in permanent shadow. His mother's banishment file was thicker than he remembered, the leather cover cracked with age, and his hands were steady as he laid it on the desk and lit a single candle, though they trembled slightly when he opened to the first page and saw the trial transcripts in the court scribe's meticulous hand, every word of his mother's confession preserved in ink that had faded from black to brown. She had admitted everything without hesitation, he read, had stood before the council and acknowledged that yes, she had hidden a human rebellion leader in the palace wine cellar for 3 days while the guards searched the city, had fed her and tended her wounds, and eventually helped her escape to the northern wastes. And when asked why she would commit such obvious treason, Eleanor Thorne had said simply that the woman reminded her of someone she loved, which the transcript noted had made the young King Lucian, newly crowned after his father's violent death, visibly flinch, though he'd recovered quickly, and pronounced the sentence of permanent exile without his voice breaking even once. Lucian turned the pages, each one a knife in his chest, reading the property dispersal orders and the guard assignments, and the formal severing of all family ties, until he reached the back of the file where a sealed envelope had been tucked between the final pages, yellowed with age and marked in his mother's handwriting with words that made his vision blur. To be opened only by my son, should he ever seek to understand, it read, and Lucian stared at it for a full minute, while his hands shook so badly he had to press them flat against the desk to make them stop, because he had carried this file from the palace to the archives 60 years ago and had never once looked inside, had told himself he didn't need to understand, because understanding was just another word for weakness, and weakness would get him killed the way it had almost gotten him killed when his father had discovered Eleanor's mercy and had beaten Lucian unconscious for having a mother soft enough to love humans. He broke the seal with fingers that felt numb, unfolded the parchment that crackled with age, and began to read in his mother's elegant script that wavered in places as if she'd been crying while she wrote. Lucian, the letter began, I chose that human's life because she reminded me of the boy you were before your father's cruelty taught you to kill your heart, back when you would bring injured birds to the kitchen and beg the cooks to help you save them, when you wept over dead flowers and asked me why beautiful things had to die, when you still believed that power and compassion could exist in the same person without one destroying the other. You will exile me. I know this. I have always known this, because I know what your father told you the night he died, that any sign of weakness in you would give the noble houses permission to tear you apart and scatter your bones across the territory, as a warning to future kings who thought mercy was compatible with survival. You must exile me to prove you are strong enough to rule. To show them you can kill your own heart if that is what keeping your throne requires. And I want you to know that I understand, that I chose this knowing full well what it would cost both of us, because the alternative was watching your father beat the mercy out of you the way he tried to beat it out of me. And I loved you too much to let that happen while I still had the power to draw his rage toward myself instead. But know this, my beloved son, my boy who cried over dead flowers. Mercy is not weakness. It is the only immortal thing we have, the only part of us that survives when our bodies turn to dust and our names are forgotten, because an act of compassion echoes forward through time in ways that violence never can, creating ripples that touch lives we will never see and change futures we cannot imagine. One day, someone will show you compassion when you deserve only judgment, will offer you grace when you have earned nothing but condemnation, and when that day comes, I need you to remember that I loved you enough to leave so you could rule, loved you enough to become the sacrifice that kept you safe, loved you enough to spend eternity in exile if it meant you survived long enough to find your way back to the boy who saved injured birds. I have always loved you, I will always love you, and nothing you do or fail to do will ever change that. Not exile, not silence, not 60 years or 600, because a mother's love is the one immortal thing even vampires cannot kill. Your mother, Eleanor. The letter ended there, and Lucian's chest cracked open with a sound he didn't recognize. A wounded animal noise that came from somewhere so deep he didn't know he still had depths. And then he was crying, actually crying. Tears he hadn't shed in 6 centuries pouring down his face while his shoulders heaved and his breath came in ragged gasps that sounded like breaking. He cried for the boy who'd saved injured birds, for the mother who'd sacrificed herself to protect him, For 60 years of frozen silence and the terrible weight of pretending he didn't love her. For every execution warrant he'd signed and every mercy he'd denied because mercy was weakness and weakness was death. And underneath it all, he cried because the letter had reframed everything, had shown him that his mother's crime wasn't betrayal but love, that her mercy had been an act of protection aimed at drawing his father's violence away from Lucian and onto herself where it could do less permanent damage. The candle burned lower, wax pooling on the ancient desk, and slowly, slowly, the tsunami of grief receded enough for something else to surface, something that felt like grim resolve and terrible clarity. The understanding that Mara had done the same thing his mother had done 60 years ago, had shown compassion to someone who needed it without calculating the cost, and that he had been testing her to find the flaw in her mercy when the real test was whether he had the courage to protect what she represented. Before dawn broke, while the sky outside the narrow window was still deep blue going gray, Lucien left the archives and walked through the silent palace to the servant wing where Eleanor was being kept under guard, and when the guard saw the king approaching, he stepped aside without needing to be told, because something in Lucien's face made it clear that whatever was about to happen, interference would be unwise. Eleanor's room was narrow and plain, just a cot and a single window with frost creeping across the glass, and she woke when he entered, her eyes flying open with the instant alertness of someone who'd spent 60 years sleeping with one ear, listening for danger. What she saw made her breath catch, made her push herself upright against the stone wall, because her son, the vampire king, who had not knelt to anyone in 600 years, was kneeling beside her cot with her letter clutched in his hand and his face wet with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. She touched his face with trembling fingers, traced the tracks of salt water like she was mapping a miracle, and he broke again, collapsing forward until his forehead rested against her shoulder and her hand found his hair, stroking it the way she had when he was small and frightened of his father's rages. And they stayed like that while 60 years of silence shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. When Lucian finally pulled back, his voice came out raw and scraped, barely recognizable as the cold authority the council knew. "I signed your exile to survive him," he said, the words falling between them like stones. "I've hated myself every night since, hated that I was too weak to defy him, too afraid of dying to choose you, too broken to believe that mercy was anything but suicide." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she was smiling through the tears, that gentle smile he remembered from childhood. "I never blamed you," she whispered. "I only prayed you'd find your way back to who you were, back to the boy who cried over dead flowers and believed beautiful things deserved to be saved." Lucian's throat tightened, but he forced the words out because she needed to hear them. "The girl, Mara, she's showing me, one threadbare coat at a time, that maybe you were right, that maybe mercy is the only immortal thing we have." He paused, gathering courage. "I have one more trial to give her, but if she passes, and she will because I'm going to make sure she does, I'm invoking the mercy precedent for both of you, pardoning her for helping you and you for the crime that sent you away." Eleanor's face crumpled with relief, but then she shook her head urgently. "Give them me," she said. "Reinstate me with conditions, with restrictions, with whatever they need to save face. But let Mara go free. Let her walk away from this without carrying the weight of having changed vampire law." Lucien's jaw set, that stubborn line Eleanor recognized from the child he'd been. "No," he said flatly. "I'm not giving them you, and I'm not letting them think this was about one girl's temporary compassion. I'm giving them the old law, Mother. I'm rewriting the mercy precedent entirely, changing it from one act of compassion per reign to one act per moon, making mercy a practice instead of a relic, building a system where what Mara did isn't exceptional, but expected." Eleanor's eyes widened, her hand going to her throat. "You'll destabilize everything your father built," she breathed, and there was fear in her voice, but also pride. The fierce satisfaction of a mother watching her son finally become who she'd always believed he could be. Good, Lucien said, and his voice was ice and iron and absolute conviction. He built it on fear, on the idea that only cruelty could keep vampires from tearing each other apart, on the belief that showing mercy was signing your own death warrant. I'll build something new, something that proves power and compassion can exist in the same kingdom, in the same king, without one destroying the other. He stood, his shadow falling across her in the pre-dawn light filtering through the window. The council will resist, he continued. Thane and the old families will see this as weakness, and they'll come for my throne, but I'm done pretending that mercy is suicide and love is a liability. She changed me, Mother. That girl with her threadbare coat and her impossible kindness. She cracked open everything I built to protect myself and showed me that what I thought was strength was just fear wearing a crown. Eleanor reached for his hand, held it between both of hers. The boy who saved injured birds, she whispered. I knew he was still in there. I knew my son wasn't lost forever. They stayed like that while the sky outside turned from gray to pale gold, the first hint of winter sunrise cutting through the ice on the window, and Lucien felt something shift in his chest. Some fundamental reordering of priorities that put Mara's survival and his mother's restoration and the soul of his kingdom above the iron control he'd maintained for 6 centuries. He was no longer testing Mara to find her weakness. He realized he was engineering her victory, designing the final trial to showcase her mercy in a way the council couldn't dismiss or diminish, because she had already changed him beyond recognition, and now he needed to change the kingdom to match. Needed to build a world where threadbare coats and frozen beggars and impossible compassion weren't aberrations, but foundations. Morning broke cold and merciless, the kind of December day where the sun rose but brought no warmth, and Lucien was already in the council chamber before the first light touched the windows. Standing at the head of the obsidian table where he'd signed 3 execution warrants, what felt like a lifetime ago, but had only been 2 days, waiting for the 12 vampire nobles who comprised his inner council to assemble with Victor at his right hand, like a promise of violence if anyone stepped out of line. They came in silence, reading the tension in the room the way predators sensed blood. And when they were seated, Lucien didn't waste time on pleasantries or preamble, but announced in a voice that permitted no interruption that he was restructuring the mercy precedent, pending the outcome of the final trial. That the law which had allowed 1 act of compassion per reign would be expanded to 1 act per lunar cycle, that mercy would become practice instead of relic. That the kingdom his father had built on fear would be rebuilt on something more sustainable. The room erupted exactly as he'd known it would, nobles surging to their feet with objections that ranged from, "You'll make us weak," to "This violates every tradition we've maintained for 8 centuries. But it was Lord Thane who cut through the noise with words designed to sound like reason and land like accusation. "You'd overturn centuries of law for a human servant and a disgraced exile," Thane said, his voice dripping with contempt that was really rage because Mara had humiliated him in front of the court, and he wanted her blood on the marble for it. Lucien met his eyes across the table and didn't blink, didn't soften, just let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable before answering with precision that cut like a blade. "I'd overturn it for the principle they represent," he said, his voice cold iron. "Our laws have made us strong but brittle, and brittle things break when pressure comes from unexpected angles, when the world changes and we're too rigid to adapt, when we've built everything on fear and forgotten that fear only works until someone stops being afraid." Thane's face went tight with fury, and he did exactly what Lucien had anticipated, demanded a vote of no confidence, called for the council to remove a king who'd clearly gone soft in his old age. But Lucien had 8 centuries of political maneuvering behind him, and he invoked his sovereign right to defer the vote until after solstice. Buying himself 48 hours, that might be enough to change everything, or might just be delaying the inevitable moment when they tore him off his throne and scattered his ashes as a warning to future kings who thought mercy was compatible with power. The session ended in hostile silence, nobles filing out with faces that promised retribution, and Victor pulled Lucian aside when the room had emptied, his voice low and urgent in the way of someone delivering bad news to a friend who already knew it was coming. "Sire," Victor said, "you're gambling your throne on a girl who's passed 2 trials by luck and heart, which is admirable, but not sustainable when facing nobles who've been waiting centuries for you to show weakness." "The 3rd trial must be public," Victor continued, "and it must be undeniable. Something so clear that even your enemies can't twist it into proof of your unfitness, or they'll tear you down and kill her in the same breath just to make a point about what happens when kings forget their place." Lucian nodded, already knowing this, already designing the final trial to be so public and so perfect that the council would have no choice but to acknowledge what Mara represented, even if they hated every second of it. Midday found Mara being escorted to the throne room by guards who wouldn't meet her eyes, and when she entered she found Lucien alone on his throne, backlit by winter sun that turned him into a silhouette again. Though now she could see the person behind the shadow, could recognize the tension in his shoulders that meant he was carrying weight he didn't want to share. He explained Trial 3 with the same careful precision he'd used for the others, told her that tomorrow at the solstice feast she would be brought before the entire court, every noble and guard and servant assembled to witness, and that she would be offered a choice he couldn't reveal in advance, only that it would test whether her mercy extended even to those who'd wronged her, whether her compassion was truly universal or just selective kindness aimed at people she deemed worthy. She would face someone who had cause to harm her, Lucian continued, and she must decide his fate, and the entire kingdom would watch her make that decision and judge whether mercy was weakness or strength made visible. Mara's stomach twisted into knots that pulled tighter with every word. But she agreed because what else could she do when Eleanor's life and her own, and apparently Lucian's entire reign, hung on whether she could be perfect under pressure, and she saw something almost apologetic flicker across his face before he dismissed her with instructions to rest and prepare. The afternoon brought Lord Thane like a knife in the dark, cornering her in a shadowed corridor where no guards patrolled and no servants lingered, his presence menacing in the way of predators who knew they had their prey trapped. He was venomous as he leaned close enough that she could smell wine and malice on his breath, telling her with obvious satisfaction that she'd humiliated him in front of the king, and tomorrow when she was given power over him in that trial, because of course she'd figured out he was the someone who'd wronged her. The council expected her to show that her mercy was a lie, that she was just another human pretending to be good until given the chance for revenge. "Destroy me and you prove you're vindictive," Thane said, his smile sharp and ugly. "Spare me, and I'll make sure every noble in attendance knows you're weak, and your compassion is just cowardice dressed up in pretty words. And either way, you lose because I've made it impossible for you to win." He paused, letting it sink in. "And when you lose, the king loses his throne, because I've convinced enough council members that his protection of you is proof he's unfit to rule, that he's gone soft and sentimental and will lead us into ruin if we don't remove him now while we still can." Thane walked away whistling, leaving Mara shaking in the corridor with the understanding that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival or Eleanor's freedom, but for Lucien's entire reign, that she'd become a pawn in a game where the nobles were using her inevitable failure to justify a coup that would end with her execution and Lucien's removal, and everything reverting to the brutal status quo that had ruled for 8 centuries. Evening found her in the gardens for the first time, seeking Lucien because she needed to understand why he was doing this, why he was risking everything for a janitor he'd never noticed until 3 days ago, and when she found him standing among frost-rimed hedges with starlight turning his dark hair silver, she walked up to him and asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment he'd invoked the mercy precedent. "Why are you doing this?" she said, not bothering to soften it with titles or deference, just asking human to human, person to person, and he was silent for so long she thought he might not answer, might retreat behind the cold authority he wore like armor. But then he spoke, and his voice was raw in a way she'd never heard from him. "Because you gave your coat to a stranger in the cold," he said simply. "I've signed execution warrants for less than that, condemned people to death, or exile for crimes that mattered far more in the eyes of vampire law. And if I can't protect someone who does something that purely good, that uncomplicatedly compassionate, then I don't deserve this throne or this crown, or any of the power I've spent 8 centuries accumulating." Mara felt something shift in her chest, understanding flooding through her that he wasn't testing her anymore, hadn't been testing her since he'd read his mother's letter and decided to rewrite the entire legal foundation of his kingdom, that he was fighting for her the way she'd fight for anyone cold and helpless in a courtyard at midnight. The air between them shifted, charged with something that made her breath catch, and he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the green of his eyes even in starlight, close enough that when his hand lifted toward her face, she thought he was going to touch her, and she didn't retreat, didn't flinch, just waited to see if a vampire king would bridge the final inches between them. His hand stopped short, hovering an inch from her cheek, fingers trembling with restraint that looked like it cost him everything. And when he spoke, his voice was tight with something that might have been fear or desire, or both tangled together. "If you fail tomorrow," he said, "they'll kill you before they take my crown. They'll make an example of you to prove that mercy gets you nothing but a blade in the dark, and I won't be able to stop it, because the moment you fail that trial, I lose all authority to protect you." His eyes burned into hers. "So you have to be perfect. Do you understand? You have to be so undeniably right that even Thane and his faction can't twist it into weakness." Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt, clear and determined. "Then tell me how," she said. And he did. Explained that she needed to show them mercy wasn't about being soft or weak or unable to defend yourself, that true compassion was about being strong enough to absorb cruelty and return grace, about having the power to destroy someone and choosing not to because you'd rather build than break. "Thane will try to provoke you into vengeance," Lucienne continued. "He'll say things designed to make you angry, to make you lash out and prove you're just as petty and vindictive as any noble who's ever held power. And you cannot give him that satisfaction. You have to stay so calm and so certain that everyone watching understands your mercy comes from strength and not from weakness." Their faces were inches apart, breath clouding between them in the frozen air, and Mara could feel the pull between them like gravity, like something inevitable that was only waiting for the right moment to collapse the distance entirely. But Lucian pulled back first, his jaw going tight with visible effort, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Get some sleep," he said roughly. "Tomorrow we both stand trial, you for your life and me for my throne, and both of us for the future of a kingdom that's never seen a king fall in love with the principle of mercy made flesh in a janitor who gave away her only coat." He left her standing in the garden, and Mara watched him go with the understanding that what was happening between them was more than gratitude or fascination, that somewhere in the last 3 days she'd fallen in love with a vampire king who was risking everything to protect her right to be compassionate, and the realization was terrifying and exhilarating and completely impossible to act on until they both survived tomorrow. Night brought Victor to Lucien's chambers. Finding the king standing by the fire with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, staring into flames that threw dancing shadows across his face, and Victor didn't waste time on subtlety because they were past that now, past the careful dance of subordinate and ruler, down to the bedrock of friendship that had survived 3 centuries. "You're in love with her," Victor said, not a question but a statement of fact, and Lucienne didn't deny it, didn't even try to deflect, just nodded once and kept staring at the fire as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Victor crossed his arms, his expression troubled, but not judgmental. "She's human," he said gently, "mortal. Even if you save her tomorrow, She'll age and die and leave you with another 600 years of existence to spend remembering what it felt like to love someone who couldn't stay. Lucien's voice when he answered was quiet, but absolutely certain. Then I'll have loved someone worth losing, he said, which is more than I've done in 8 centuries of signing execution warrants and maintaining iron control and pretending I didn't have a heart that could break. He turned to face Victor. I've spent 600 years being the king my father made me into, cold and brutal and effective, and I'm tired, Victor. I'm so tired of being that person when Mara showed me in 3 days that there's another way to rule, another kind of strength that doesn't require killing everything soft in yourself. Victor studied him for a long moment, then nodded with the finality of a decision made. Then we make sure she survives tomorrow, he said. I'll position guards to block any council interference. Make sure no one can touch her before she completes the trial. Buy you enough time to get her through this alive. Lucien gripped his shoulder, the gesture carrying 8 centuries of trust and friendship. Thank you, old friend, he said, and Victor smiled grimly, because they both knew tomorrow would either change everything or destroy them all. Simultaneously, in her small room, Eleanor was visiting Mara, arriving with the quiet determination of a mother about to tell truths her son had kept buried for 60 years, and she sat on the narrow bed and took Mara's hands and began explaining what had made Lucien into the frozen king he'd become. His father brutalized him, Eleanor said. Her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes, punished every act of mercy as weakness, beat him bloody whenever he showed compassion to servants or sympathy for prisoners, turned kindness into something shameful that had to be hidden or destroyed. My banishment was Lucien's first test as king, Eleanor continued. His father's dying command was to exile me or be considered unfit to rule, to prove he could kill his own heart if that's what keeping the throne required. And he chose the crown because I begged him to, because I loved him enough to know that his death would serve nothing, and his reign might eventually serve everything if he could just survive long enough to remember who he was before his father broke him. He's carried that guilt like a blade in his chest ever since, Eleanor said. Waking up every morning for 60 years, knowing he condemned his own mother to exile, hating himself for being too afraid to choose love over power. And you've pulled that blade out, Mara. You've shown him that mercy isn't weakness, and compassion isn't suicide, and he can be both king and human without destroying himself in the process. Her grip tightened on Mara's hands. Don't let them put it back in, she said fiercely. Tomorrow when you face Thane and make your choice, remember that you're not just saving yourself. You're saving my son from the prison he's lived in, since he was barely old enough to hold a sword. You're giving him permission to be the person he was meant to be before cruelty taught him that love was a liability. Mara understood then that tomorrow wasn't just her trial or Lucien's or even the kingdom's, but a moment where everything could shift or everything could shatter, where her choice would either prove that mercy could coexist with power or confirm that compassion was just weakness waiting to be exploited. And she went to sleep that night with Eleanor's words echoing in her mind, and Lucien's almost touch burning on her skin, and the weight of 3 lives and 1 kingdom's future resting on her ability to absorb cruelty and return grace. The great hall had been transformed into something between a throne room and an arena. Every noble and guard and servant in the kingdom packed into the vaulted space until the air itself felt compressed, heavy with breath and anticipation, and the smoke from 100 candles that turned the stone walls into flickering gold. And Mara stood in the center of it all, a spotlight of firelight and eyes, feeling the weight of every gaze like physical pressure against her skin. She'd been brought in through the main doors so everyone could watch her walk the length of the hall, past servants who looked at her with something like hope and nobles, who looked at her with something like hunger, past Victor standing at attention with his hand on his sword, and Eleanor sitting in a place of honor that had shocked the entire court because she was wearing a restored gown of deep purple velvet instead of beggar's rags, her hair braided with silver thread, No longer an exile, but a dowager queen reclaiming her rightful position after 60 years of wilderness. Lucian sat on the throne wearing his crown, his face an unreadable mask of authority that gave nothing away. And Mara's heart stuttered because she couldn't tell if the man from the garden was still inside that cold exterior, or if he'd retreated back into the frozen king his father had created. If last night's almost touch had been real, or just a moment of weakness he'd already buried under 8 centuries of practiced control. The crowd settled into expectant silence, and Lucien rose, his voice carrying through the hall, with the resonance of someone who'd spent lifetimes commanding attention and obedience. 3 nights ago, he began, this woman showed mercy to an exile, breaking our oldest law by offering aid to someone condemned to suffer, and under the mercy precedent, I tested her heart to determine whether her compassion was genuine or merely impulse, whether mercy could survive scrutiny or would crumble under pressure. He paused, letting his words sink in. She has passed 2 trials, proving her mercy extends beyond convenience to genuine sacrifice. And tonight the third and final trial will be witnessed by all of you, every noble and servant and guard, because her fate and mine will be decided by the choice she makes in this hall. He signaled to the guards, and they brought forth Lord Thane, bound at the wrists with silver cord that would burn against vampire skin, his face a mask of barely controlled rage that made Mara's stomach twist because she knew what was coming, had figured it out the moment Lucian mentioned someone who'd wronged her. The crowd's murmur rose like a wave, confusion and intrigue and anticipation mixing into a sound that made Mara want to run. But she held her ground because Eleanor was watching, and Lucian was trusting, and 300 years of servants were hoping she wouldn't fail them. Lucian's voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. Lord Thane falsely accused a human servant 3 nights ago, he said, framed an innocent man to test my leniency and see if I would execute based on a noble's word alone, and today he threatened the petitioner in an attempt to undermine this trial and force her into a position where any choice she made would be used against her. Under our law, Lucian continued, his eyes sweeping the assembled nobles with a look that dared them to contradict him. False accusation carries the punishment of the crime alleged, and since Thane demanded hand amputation for his fabricated thief, that same sentence now applies to him. He turned his gaze to Mara, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been apology or encouragement, or both. Mara, he said, you judged his case once and showed mercy to the accused. Now you will execute the sentence against the accuser, or show him the same mercy he tried to deny you. His pause was deliberate, weighted. Choose. The hall went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that felt like held breath, like the moment before lightning strikes, and Mara understood with crystalline clarity that this was the perfect trap Thane had promised, the impossible choice designed to destroy her, no matter what she decided. If she demanded his punishment, she proved mercy was selective and conditional, just kindness for people she deemed worthy, while cruelty waited for those who crossed her, and the council would use that to reject Lucian's reforms, as the fantasy of a king who didn't understand that humans were just as vindictive as vampires when given power. If she pardoned Thane completely, he would keep his position and his influence and his rage, and he would spend the rest of her short human life finding ways to destroy her while making sure every noble in the kingdom knew that her compassion was just weakness, dressed up in pretty words, cowardice masquerading as virtue. The room waited, hundreds of eyes fixed on her like she was an equation they were trying to solve, and Mara felt the pressure of it trying to crush her into making the wrong choice, into proving that 3 days of trials had been for nothing because she was exactly what Thane said she was. A human pretending to be better than she actually was until the moment she was given the chance for revenge. She looked at Thane first, saw the smug certainty on his face that she would break, that she would either destroy him and prove herself vindictive, or spare him and prove herself weak, that either way, He'd won because he'd made it impossible for her to be right. She looked at Lucian next, saw his eyes steady and trusting in a way that made her chest ache because he'd gambled everything on her ability to find a third option, to be brilliant enough to thread the needle between vengeance and cowardice, and she couldn't let him down, couldn't let Eleanor down, couldn't let every servant in this hall down when they were watching her with desperate hope that someone like them could stand in front of vampire nobility and choose grace instead of cruelty. She looked at Eleanor last, saw the Dowager Queen nod with fierce determination, and heard her words from last night echo in her mind. Be strong. Don't let them put the blade back in my son's chest. Show them that mercy isn't weakness, but strength made visible. Mara's voice when she spoke was clear and steady, carrying through the hall without her having to shout, filling the silence the way water filled empty spaces. Lord Thane, she said, looking directly at him, you tried to teach me that mercy is weakness, that compassion is just naivety, waiting to be punished, that showing kindness to people who want to hurt you is suicide dressed up as virtue. Her pause was deliberate. You were wrong. The hall seemed to lean forward, and Mara felt something settle into place inside her, the certainty that came from knowing exactly what needed to be said, and having the courage to say it. Mercy is the hardest thing I've ever done, she continued, because it means looking at someone who wants to hurt me and choosing not to hurt them back. It means absorbing cruelty and returning grace. It means being strong enough to break the cycle of vengeance instead of adding another link to the chain. So here's my choice. I pardon your hand. The crowd erupted in confusion, but Mara wasn't finished, and she raised her voice to cut through the noise. But I don't pardon your silence, she said, and turned to face Lucian, addressing him directly because this part of her sentence needed royal approval to have any weight. Sire, I ask that Lord Thane be required to serve 1 season in the human quarters, not as punishment, but as education, as an opportunity to see the people he's treated as lesser and learn whether his contempt is based on truth or just inherited prejudice. She could feel Thane's fury radiating from behind her, but she didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Let him clean our halls and tend our sick and live on our rations, Mara continued, and if at the end of that season he still believes humans are beneath him, then he's free to return to this hall and say so. Her voice softened, but didn't waver. But he won't be able to say he never knew us. He won't be able to claim ignorance about who we are and what we do, and how we survive in a kingdom that treats us as tools instead of people. And maybe that knowledge will change him, or maybe it won't, but at least the choice to change will be his instead of mine. The great hall erupted into chaos, nobles shouting objections or surprise or grudging admiration, some outraged that she'd dare to sentence a lord to servant's work, and others stunned by the elegant cruelty of making Thane live among the people he despised, and through it all the servants remained silent for a long breathless moment before one started clapping, slow and deliberate, then another joined, then another, until the entire human section of the hall was applauding with tears streaming down their faces because someone like them had stood in front of vampire nobility and found a way to choose mercy without choosing weakness, had shown that compassion could have teeth and still remain compassionate. Thane's face went purple with rage, his mouth opening to protest, but he couldn't argue without looking craven, couldn't claim the sentence was unjust when she'd pardoned the physical punishment and only asked that he gain understanding, couldn't refuse to serve among humans without admitting he was too weak to do the work they did every day. Mara risked a glance at Lucien and found his eyes blazing with something that looked like pride and hunger and fierce joy all tangled together, something molten that made her breath catch. And when he stood from the throne, the entire hall fell silent again to hear what judgment the king would pass. The trial is past, Lucien said, his voice ringing with finality that permitted no argument. Mara has shown mercy paired with accountability, the rarest and most difficult form of justice, proving that compassion doesn't require ignorance of wrongdoing, but rather demands we face it honestly and still choose grace over vengeance. He descended the steps with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing in the silent hall. Under my sovereign right, I invoke the mercy precedent, and pardon both Mara and Eleanor Thorne, my mother whom I banished in grief and pride 60 years ago, and have regretted every moment since. He looked directly at the council, his expression challenging them to object. And I declare the mercy precedent restructured. Henceforth, one act of compassion may be pardoned per lunar cycle, petitioned by anyone in this kingdom regardless of status or species, judged by this throne according to the principles Mara has demonstrated. His pause was weighted with centuries of authority. Mercy will no longer be a relic we invoke once per reign and then forget. It will be a practice we maintain and refine, because a kingdom that cannot bend will eventually break, and I will not let this realm shatter from its own rigidity. Lord Thane snarled from his position between the guards, his voice sharp with venom. You'd undo centuries of law for a human girl, he spat, making it sound like an accusation of weakness. A king gone soft and sentimental over a pretty face and a few kind words. And Mara saw several nobles lean forward, because this was the question they all wanted answered, the thing they'd been wondering since Lucian had first invoked the mercy precedent and set this entire chain of events into motion. Lucian stopped in front of Mara, close enough that she could see the green of his eyes and the exhaustion he was hiding, and the fierce determination that had carried him through 600 years of ruling with an iron fist. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried through the hall with perfect clarity, because every person present was straining to hear. No, Lucienne said simply. I'd undo centuries of law because she showed me what I'd forgotten in 800 years of signing execution warrants and maintaining control through fear. Because she reminded me that power without compassion is just cruelty with a crown, that strength without mercy is just brittleness waiting to shatter, that ruling through terror only works until someone stops being afraid and shows you there's another way. He extended his hand to her, palm up, an equal offering, and not a command, not a king summoning a subject, but a man asking a woman to join him in building something new. Mara stared at his hand for a heartbeat, understanding that this was the public declaration that had been building since the garden, the vampire equivalent of a marriage proposal, because a king did not offer his hand to a human in front of the entire court unless he was claiming her as something infinitely more than a subject or a servant, or even a friend. She took his hand, her fingers sliding into his palm. And the crowd gasped as if they'd witnessed something impossible. A vampire king touching a human with tenderness instead of cruelty, with partnership instead of possession, with love instead of hunger. And Mara felt the warmth of his skin against hers and thought, this is real. This is happening. We're standing in front of 300 witnesses and declaring that the world can be different if we're brave enough to make it so. Victor stepped forward first, his armor creaking as he dropped to one knee before Lucienne, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of service. I pledge to uphold the new law, he said, and one by one the guards followed their captain's lead, kneeling in waves of metal and loyalty, and then the servants were moving, weeping as they knelt, because someone had finally given them permission to hope that their lives might matter, that their humanity might be worth protecting instead of exploiting. The nobles were divided. Mara could see it in their faces, half of them calculating whether this change would benefit them, and half of them furious at having their world turned upside down by a human janitor and a king who'd apparently lost his mind. But enough of them knelt that the rest followed or risked isolation, risked being marked as enemies of a throne that had just demonstrated it was willing to rewrite the entire legal foundation of the kingdom for the sake of principle. Thane was forced to kneel last, his face twisted with humiliation as he bent his knee to a king who'd just sentenced him to a season of servitude among the very people he'd spent 2 centuries despising, and Mara felt a flicker of satisfaction that was probably unworthy, but felt perfectly justified given what he'd tried to do to her. Eleanor rose from her seat with the grace of a woman who'd spent 60 years in exile but hadn't forgotten how to be a queen, and she crossed the floor to her son, her eyes bright with tears she was too dignified to shed in public. And when Lucian took her hand as well, the hall held its breath, because 3 hands were now joined: past, present, future, dowager queen and reigning king and human servant, forming a chain that represented everything the old kingdom had forbidden, and everything the new kingdom might become. Mara felt the weight of history in that moment, felt like they were standing at the hinge point where everything could tip toward light or darkness, toward progress or regression, toward a future where mercy was practiced, or a past where cruelty was law. But before the moment could settle into triumph, a messenger burst through the doors at the far end of the hall, a rare and shocking breach of protocol that had every guard reaching for their weapons until they recognized the royal courier's livery, and he ran down the center aisle with his face pale and his breath coming in gasps that suggested he'd sprinted from wherever he'd been stationed. He whispered urgently to Victor, who went absolutely ashen, his expression shifting from joy to dread in the space of a heartbeat. And when he approached Lucienne, his usual composure was cracked with something that looked like fear. "Sire," Victor said quietly, though in the silent hall his words carried farther than he probably intended, "there's been a challenge. 3 of the old families have invoked the blood right. They're demanding a formal duel for the throne at dawn. And if you refuse, the kingdom splits into civil war because they'll claim you're too weak to defend your radical decree, and half the nobility will support their claim." Mara felt the floor drop out from under her, felt like everything they'd just won was being snatched away before they could even celebrate, and she saw Lucian's jaw tighten with the grim acceptance of someone who'd known this was coming, who'd calculated the risk and made his choice anyway, but had still hoped the old guard wouldn't push it this far. The blood right was ancient law, older than the mercy precedent, older than most of the current nobility, a mechanism that allowed vampire lords to challenge a king's radical decree through single combat if they could convince enough of their peers that the decree would lead to the kingdom's destruction. The king must fight 3 champions, one after another, before the sun rose on the day following the decree's announcement, and if he lost even one duel, he was forced to abdicate and rescind his changes. But if he won all 3 battles, his new law would stand uncontested for at least a century, because nobody could invoke the blood right again until the next significant legal restructuring. Lucian looked at Mara, and she saw the calculation in his eyes that made her want to scream, the exhausted math of a man who'd been awake for 2 nights, who'd spent himself emotionally in ways that were probably more draining than physical combat, and dawn was only 5 hours away, which meant he'd have to fight 3 fresh champions while running on nothing but willpower and stubborn determination to prove that mercy could coexist with strength. She leaned close enough that only he could hear, her voice fierce and certain. "You can do this," she whispered, because she refused to believe they'd come this far only to lose him to some archaic combat ritual, refused to accept that the universe would let her fall in love with a vampire king and then kill him before they could even kiss. His hand came up to touch her face, finally completing the gesture from the garden, his palm warm against her cheek and his thumb brushing her skin with a tenderness that made her eyes burn. "If I don't survive," he said quietly, "promise me you'll run. Take my mother and Victor will get you north to the border. There are human kingdoms there who'll give you asylum, and you can live the rest of your life in sunlight instead of dying in this hall when the old guard takes revenge." Mara shook her head, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I didn't stand in the center of this hall and redefine mercy just to abandon you the moment it gets dangerous. I didn't fall in love with you only to run when you need me most." The words were out before she could stop them. The confession she'd been holding since the garden finally breaking free, and she saw his eyes widen with something that looked like wonder and pain and desperate hope all tangled together. The hall was watching, the entire court witnessing this exchange, even though they couldn't hear the words, and Mara didn't care anymore about propriety or protocol or what it meant for a human to love a vampire king. She only cared that he knew, that if he was going to fight 3 duels on no sleep and emotional exhaustion, he would do it knowing someone loved him enough to stay and watch him bleed rather than save herself by running. The duel arena was the courtyard where Mara had first given her coat to Eleanor, and she understood immediately that Lucian had chosen this location deliberately, had wanted the symbolic weight of fighting for mercy in the exact spot where mercy had first been shown, where a simple act of human kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would either reshape the kingdom or end in his death. The crowd assembled in waves of silk and armor and rough-spun cloth, nobles claiming the balconies that ringed the courtyard, while servants packed themselves onto the frozen ground, and Mara stood in a guarded pavilion with Eleanor, both of them wrapped in fur-lined cloaks that did nothing to stop the cold from seeping into her bones. Though she suspected the chill she felt had less to do with winter and more to do with watching the man she loved prepare to fight 3 duels on no sleep, and emotional exhaustion that would have felled someone with less than 8 centuries of stubborn determination. The 3 champions stepped forward from the crowd of old nobility, and Mara felt her stomach twist because they were all older vampires, the kind who moved with the deadly grace that came from centuries of combat training, the kind who'd probably been warriors before they'd been turned and had spent their immortal lives perfecting the art of killing. They wore no armor, needed no weapons beyond fangs and supernatural strength, and they looked at Lucian with the cold assessment of predators who'd already calculated how to bring down wounded prey. Victor announced the rules in a voice that carried across the silent courtyard. Single combat, no weapons but what nature provided, first blood or yield, and the king must defeat all 3 champions before dawn broke or forfeit his throne and rescind the mercy law, returning the kingdom to the brutal certainty of the old ways where compassion was weakness and cruelty was law. Lucian shed his crown and coat with movements that were slower than they should have been, exhaustion evident in the way he rolled his shoulders and the shadows under his eyes that looked like bruises in the torchlight. And Mara wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, that they couldn't ask him to fight when he'd barely slept in 3 days and had spent himself emotionally in ways that were probably more draining than any physical combat. His gaze found her across the courtyard, green eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she nodded with all the fierce certainty she could project. "I believe in you. I know you can do this. I'm not going anywhere no matter what happens." He smiled, brief and sharp, then turned to face the first champion with the coiled readiness of someone who'd survived 800 years by refusing to quit no matter how impossible the odds. The first duel began at midnight, with the champion launching himself at Lucienne in a blur of supernatural speed that Mara could barely track, and she saw immediately that Lucienne was slower than he should have been, his reflexes dulled by fatigue, his movements a half-second behind where they needed to be. The champion was brutal and efficient, pressing his advantage with the ruthless calculation of someone fighting for ideology rather than personal glory, and when his claws raked across Lucian's ribs, opening a gash that spilled dark blood onto the frozen ground, Mara flinched so hard that Eleanor had to grab her hand to keep her from rushing forward. The servants gasped, the nobles murmured, and Mara could see the champion's confidence growing as he circled Lucienne like a wolf around wounded prey, convinced that the king's exhaustion would be his downfall. But Lucienne adjusted his strategy with the kind of tactical brilliance that came from 600 years of outthinking opponents who were stronger or faster or better rested, abandoning attempts to match the champion's speed and instead focusing on patience, on watching for the moment when aggression would overextend into vulnerability. It came when the champion lunged for Lucian's throat with the arrogant certainty of someone who thought the fight was already won, and Lucian sidestepped with minimal movement, grabbed the champion's arm, and used his own momentum to spin him into a pin that left him face down on the frozen stones, with Lucian's knee in his spine and fangs at his neck. "First blood," Victor called, and the champion yielded with furious reluctance, pulling himself to his feet and retreating to the balcony while nursing his wounded pride more than his wounded flesh. 1 down, 2 to go, and Mara let herself breathe for the first time since the duel had started. The second champion entered the arena at 2 in the morning with a different strategy, defensive and patient, clearly intending to outlast Lucien's stamina rather than overpower him with speed or strength. And Mara watched the fight devolve into a war of attrition that was somehow worse than the first duel's brutal efficiency, because she could see Lucien bleeding from multiple cuts, could see him slowing further as his body demanded rest he couldn't afford to give. She couldn't watch, but couldn't look away, trapped in the horrible paralysis of witnessing something she was powerless to stop. And Eleanor leaned close to whisper in her ear with the authority of someone who'd been married to a warrior king and understood what drove men to fight past the point of physical collapse. "He's fighting for you," Eleanor said quietly. "Let him feel your faith. Give him something beyond his own stubbornness to draw strength from." Mara stood before she'd consciously decided to move, her voice ringing across the courtyard as she shouted Lucien's name with all the fierce belief that had carried her through 3 trials and a public declaration of love. His head snapped up, their eyes locking across the blood-stained stones. And she saw the moment he drew strength from her presence, saw his exhaustion transform into renewed determination, because he wasn't fighting alone anymore, wasn't carrying this burden solely on his own shoulders. He smiled at her, brief and feral, showing fangs that were more promise than threat, and then he moved with sudden explosive speed that caught the defensive champion off guard, cornering him against the courtyard wall and forcing a yield through sheer relentless pressure that left no room for the champion to breathe or think or do anything except submit. 2 down, 1 to go, and dawn was only 2 hours away. The final champion who entered the arena at 4 in the morning was the deadliest of the 3, Thane's cousin fighting for family honor and the preservation of the old law. And Mara felt her heart sink because he was fresh while Lucien was shredded, bleeding from a dozen cuts and moving like every step cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. The fight was vicious from the first moment, the champion pressing his advantage with the cruel efficiency of someone who knew he was facing a wounded opponent and intended to exploit every weakness. And when Lucien was driven to his knees with blood streaming down his face and his breath coming in ragged gasps, Mara heard the entire courtyard inhale as one, because they all thought they were watching their king fall. Thane's cousin stood over Lucien with fangs bared and triumph written across his face, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard like a pronouncement of inevitable victory. "Yield," he said, his words carefully chosen to sound magnanimous while being utterly cruel. "And I'll let the girl live. I'll make sure she gets safe passage north instead of being executed as a traitor when the old law is restored." Mara saw Lucien's shoulders tense, saw him calculate whether her life was worth his throne, whether he should surrender his reforms to keep her safe, and she wanted to scream at him not to dare, not to sacrifice everything they'd fought for, just to protect her from consequences she'd knowingly accepted. But Lucien's response was to surge upward with the last reserves of his strength, his forehead cracking into the champion's nose, with a headbutt that was more human street fighting than vampire combat, and in the stunned moment that followed, he used the champion's own momentum against him, flipping him with a move that was pure technique, compensating for depleted strength, pinning him to the ground with fangs at his throat and blood dripping onto the champion's face. The champion yielded immediately, his voice tight with shock and fury, and Victor's call of first blood was almost drowned out by the roar of the crowd, servants cheering and nobles shouting, and the entire courtyard erupting into chaos as they watched their king complete the impossible task of defeating 3 fresh champions while running on nothing but willpower and love. Lucien collapsed the moment Victor declared him victorious, his body finally giving out after hours of forcing it past every reasonable limit, and Mara was moving before the champion had fully retreated, rushing across the courtyard with Eleanor close behind, while Victor and the guards formed a protective circle. She dropped to her knees beside Lucien, cradling his head in her lap, while her hands fluttered uselessly over his injuries because she had no idea how to help him. No training in vampire physiology or healing beyond the basic human first aid that probably didn't apply to creatures who could survive things that would kill mortals instantly. He was alive. She could feel his breath against her wrist and see his chest rising and falling, but he was barely conscious, delirious from blood loss and exhaustion, his eyes unfocused as they tried to find her face. "Did we win?" he mumbled, his voice slurred and uncertain, like he genuinely couldn't remember the last few minutes, couldn't recall whether he'd defeated the final champion or if this was some fever dream his dying brain had constructed to ease his passing. Mara laughed through tears she hadn't realized were falling, her voice breaking on the words as she brushed blood-matted hair back from his forehead with trembling fingers. "Yes," she said, "you won. You defeated all 3 champions and saved the mercy law and changed the kingdom. Now please stop trying to die, because I just told you I loved you. And it would be really unfair if you left before I got to say it again." He touched her face with a hand that left smears of blood on her cheek, his smile soft and wondering and utterly content. "Good," he whispered. "Then I can rest." And his eyes closed as consciousness left him, his body finally claiming the sleep he'd denied it for 3 days, while his mind had fought to reshape a kingdom. The healers worked through the pre-dawn hours in Lucian's chambers, treating his injuries with a combination of vampire regeneration and herbal medicine that smelled like mint and copper and something sharp that made Mara's eyes water, and she refused to leave his side, despite Victor's gentle suggestions that she should rest because watching someone you love bleed is exhausting in ways that have nothing to do with physical fatigue. Eleanor sat with her, the 2 of them keeping vigil in chairs drawn close to the bed, and as the sky outside began to pale from black to deep blue to the soft gray that preceded sunrise, Lucien's eyes opened with the sudden clarity of someone whose supernatural healing had finally caught up with their injuries. The first thing he saw was Mara asleep in the chair beside him with her hand still clutching his, her face streaked with dried tears and her body folded in an uncomfortable position that suggested she'd refused to move far enough away to properly rest, and he didn't move, didn't want to break the moment or wake her when she looked so peaceful despite the circumstances. Eleanor entered quietly, saw her son watching the girl with an expression that was tender and awed and faintly disbelieving, like he couldn't quite accept that someone had chosen to stay beside him through the worst night of his recent existence, and she smiled with the satisfaction of a mother who'd waited 60 years to see her child learn how to love again. "She didn't leave," Eleanor said softly, "not for a moment, not even when the healers said you were stable and she should rest. She just sat there holding your hand and telling you stories about her life before the castle, like she could keep you anchored to the world through the sound of her voice." Lucien's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, if vampires could cry, his voice rough with emotion that had nothing to do with his healing injuries. "I don't deserve her," he said, the words carrying the weight of 8 centuries of guilt and self-loathing, and the belief that monsters didn't get happy endings no matter how hard they tried to change. Eleanor crossed to the bed, sat on the edge with the ease of a mother who'd tended sick children long before she'd become a queen, and took her son's other hand with gentle firmness. "No," she agreed, her honesty cutting through his self-pity with the precision of someone who loved him too much to let him wallow in unearned martyrdom. "You probably don't deserve her. Not after spending 600 years being exactly the kind of king your father raised you to be. Not after all the cruelty you've signed warrants for and all the mercy you've denied." Her pause was deliberate. "But you'll spend your life trying to be worthy of what she's offered you. And that's enough. That's what growth looks like. What redemption actually means in practice rather than theory." She squeezed his hand. "Your father told you love was weakness, but he was wrong. Love is the hardest thing you'll ever do because it means being vulnerable and honest and brave enough to let someone see all the broken parts of you and trust they won't leave when they realize you're not perfect." The sun broke over the horizon at exactly 6 a.m. on the winter solstice, flooding Lucian's chambers with pale gold light that turned the frost on the windows into glittering diamonds, and he extracted his hand carefully from Mara's grip without waking her, forcing his healing body upright despite the protest of half-knit injuries that would take another day to fully close. He walked to the balcony on unsteady legs, pushing open the doors to let in air that was cold and clean and sharp with the promise of a new day, and Mara woke with a start when the winter wind swept through the room, her eyes finding him immediately with the panicked assessment of someone checking to make sure he was still alive and whole. She joined him on the balcony without bothering to grab a cloak, just stood beside him in her rumpled dress while dawn painted the city below in shades of amber and rose and the softest blue. Below them the kingdom assembled in response to Victor's summons, the captain standing at attention in the courtyard with a scroll in his hands and his voice carrying with parade ground precision as he read the formal proclamation that would reshape their world. "The blood rite has been satisfied," Victor announced. "The king has defeated 3 champions in honorable combat, and the new mercy law stands as decreed. 1 act of compassion may be pardoned per lunar cycle, petitioned by any citizen regardless of status or species, judged by the throne according to principles of accountability paired with grace." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Long live the vampire king," he shouted, and the crowd roared their response. Not all of them supportive, but enough that dissent was drowned in the tide of voices declaring allegiance to a new era. The old families were beaten, at least for now, their champions defeated, and their ideology rejected through the ancient mechanism of trial by combat, and the law they'd tried to overturn through violence was now more firmly established than any decree could have made it. Lucian turned to Mara as the crowd's roar faded into the morning air, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch, because he looked uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with politics or combat, and everything to do with the terrifying intimacy of asking for something he desperately wanted, but wasn't sure he'd earned. They were alone on the balcony for a moment, Victor and Eleanor tactfully remaining inside, and he took her hand with the same careful deliberation he'd used in the great hall, palm to palm, and fingers intertwining, like he was trying to memorize the feeling of her skin against his. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice quiet and serious. "And you're free to say no. I want you to know that, before I ask, there's no obligation or expectation or consequence if your answer is that you want to leave and build a life somewhere that doesn't involve constant political upheaval and death threats." Mara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs because she knew what he was going to ask, and she already knew her answer, but she wanted to hear him say it, wanted him to be brave enough to offer her what they both wanted, instead of hiding behind noble self-sacrifice or the assumption that she'd be better off somewhere else. "Stay," Lucian said finally, the single word carrying the weight of everything he couldn't quite articulate. 800 years of loneliness, and the desperate hope that maybe this time love wouldn't end in exile or death or bitter regret. "Not as a servant," he continued, forcing himself to be specific because vague offers could be misinterpreted, and he needed her to understand exactly what he was proposing, "as something I don't have a word for yet, advisor or partner, or the person who keeps me human even though I'm not. The voice that reminds me why mercy matters when I'm tempted to fall back into the easier cruelty of absolute control." Mara's eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to hide. Her voice caught between laughter and crying because only Lucian would frame a declaration of love as a job offer, would try to make forever sound like a professional arrangement because he was still learning how to be emotionally honest after centuries of practiced distance. "You're offering me a job," she said, making it a question even though she knew it wasn't. Knew he was offering her everything he had, and just didn't have the vocabulary yet to call it what it was. He laughed, immediately wincing as his healing ribs protested the movement, his free hand pressing against the bandages wrapped around his torso. "I'm offering you everything I have," he corrected, which granted is a broken vampire and a kingdom in upheaval, and probably about 50 new death threats per week once word of the mercy law spreads beyond our borders. But it's yours if you want it. All of it. The throne and the danger and me. Especially me, because I don't know how to do this without you anymore. She kissed him before he could say anything else, before he could talk himself out of being vulnerable or retreat into the safer distance of political partnership, her lips finding his with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what she wanted and being brave enough to take it. It was brief and soft, and tasted like salt from her tears and copper from his blood, and when she pulled back, her smile was radiant despite the crying, her voice steady and sure. "Yes," she said, the simplest and most powerful acceptance she could offer. Yes to staying, and yes to being your partner, and yes to loving you, even when it's terrifying and dangerous, and probably going to get me killed eventually. Yes to all of it, because I'd rather spend whatever time I have fighting beside you than spend a lifetime somewhere safe wondering what we could have been. The final image burned itself into Mara's memory with the clarity of something she knew she'd remember until her dying day. Standing on the balcony with Lucian while Eleanor joined them, the three of them silhouetted against the sunrise like a painting of something hopeful and new, past and present and future, united in their determination to build a kingdom where mercy wasn't just allowed, but expected. The courtyard below showed servants and nobles mingling in ways that would have been unthinkable 3 days ago, old hierarchies crumbling as people who'd never spoken began hesitant conversations about what this new era might mean. And Mara felt the weight of what they'd started, the responsibility of proving that change was possible if you were willing to fight for it, bleed for it, love someone enough to believe they could be better than their worst impulses. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the celebrations had faded into exhausted contentment, Mara stood in the palace museum looking at the coat she'd given Eleanor, now framed behind glass, with a plaque that read, "The First Mercy," in letters that caught the light and seemed to glow. It was a small thing, just a worn servant's coat that had cost her nothing but a cold walk home. But it had become the kingdom's founding symbol, the artifact that marked the moment when everything changed because one person had chosen kindness over self-preservation. She touched the glass gently, remembering the old woman in the courtyard who'd turned out to be a queen, and thought about how the smallest acts could reshape the world if you were brave enough to commit them. A raven landed on the balcony railing outside Lucian's study, where Mara and Eleanor had gathered to review the petitions that were already flooding in from citizens testing the new mercy law, its claws clicking against stone as it adjusted its position, and fixed them with the unsettling intelligence that corvids always seem to possess. Attached to its leg was a sealed letter with crimson wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, 3 crossed swords beneath a crown that looked older and more ornate than anything Mara had seen in Lucien's kingdom, and Victor retrieved it with the careful suspicion of someone who'd learned that unexpected messages rarely brought good news. Lucien broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, his expression going still in the way that Mara had learned meant he was processing something significant and deciding how much to reveal. "What is it?" she asked, crossing to stand beside him so she could see the letter, even though the formal script was dense and full of terminology she didn't recognize, names of vampire houses and references to ancient treaties, and the kind of bureaucratic language that always preceded complicated political maneuvering. Lucian's smile was wry and tired and faintly amused, like he'd expected this but had hoped for a few weeks of peace before the next crisis arrived to test their resolve. "A summons," he said, holding up the letter so she could see the elaborate signature at the bottom. 3 names written in different hands to indicate collective authority from the Northern Vampire Council. "They've heard about the new mercy law through whatever intelligence network they maintain, and they're not pleased that I'm unilaterally restructuring vampire jurisprudence without consulting the broader supernatural government." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and determination, and the kind of grim humor that came from knowing you'd just survived one impossible fight, only to be immediately drafted into another. "Looks like we have another fight coming," he said, his voice dry but steady, because apparently changing one kingdom isn't enough. Now I have to defend my reforms to a council of vampires who've spent the last millennium maintaining order through fear, and aren't going to appreciate being told that their methods are outdated and cruel. Mara took his hand, intertwining their fingers with the same deliberate care he'd shown her on the balcony, her grip firm and certain and utterly unafraid of what was coming. "Then we fight together," she said simply, "because that's what partnership means, facing the next impossible thing as a team, instead of trying to carry the burden alone." They turned back to face the sunrise that was still painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, and Mara felt the weight of the future settling onto her shoulders like a cloak, heavy but not unwelcome, full of challenges she couldn't yet imagine but would face anyway, because she'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen to believe that the world could be better if people were brave enough to make it so. The Northern Council would come, and they would fight whatever battles that summoned. And probably there would be more challenges after that, an endless succession of obstacles to test their resolve and force them to defend their principles. But she wasn't afraid anymore, wasn't the invisible janitor who'd believed herself too small to matter. She was Mara, advisor to the vampire king, keeper of his conscience, the girl who'd given her coat to a freezing stranger and accidentally started a revolution, and whatever came next, they would face it together.